What do flying ants have to do with elves that fire arrows at machine gun rates? Well, that turns out to be the unofficial remakes of Seven Samurai, or as we'll discuss, that what was originally thought to be a unofficial remake of Yojimbo. I'm John Chang again with Dan Edmonds.
Hello, hello.
And yeah, so last time we kind of mentioned this idea that, with Hawk the Slayer, the director had thought that it was Yojimbo that, he had basically copied the ideas and modeled it. But of course, as we've found, it's actually not. It's actually, the Seven Samurai.
Yeah, and it's hard to know if he does actually believe it is a remake of Yojimbo and just kind of completely got confused, or if he just got the name wrong in that particular.
Right.
But, yeah.
Before we dive more into Hawk the Slayer, I thought that one kind of relevant question or topic is, why is it that some of these films end up as kind of cult classics, right? Like, what is it about them that kind of really seems to kind of attract the following that that they really seems like on the surface shouldn't?
Yeah, well, I mean, from a very cynical angle, I kind of felt like Roger Corman's Battle Beyond the Stars and Hawk the Slayer were both kind of like stories that I remember watching as a kid and thought, they were a bit weird, but I kind of liked them. They were kind of compelling. And obviously it's just stealing someone else's idea is, if you want to be cynical. But I think the other thing is just having just very kind of unique, memorable elements that don't necessarily, it's basically playing with subverting your expectations. I think any film that does that a number of times will stick in your memory. And because there's sort of movies that just sort of plague me that I can't quite remember, but I know something like there's like two or three really weird things that happen. I've been searching for those movies for years and I just can't quite remember what they are. But I mean, if you ask me to recount anything of, I don't know, even some of these remakes that we've been doing in the last 6 months, there will be some that you could tell me and I was like, oh yeah, I mean, they're just so forgettable. But yeah.
I think there's also like this kind of scrappy element. And by that, I mean that like, there's something about like that there tend to be low budget or lower budget stuff. And the filmmakers somehow like kind of draw out, like you said, these kind of surprising elements, or they do something that kind of, it's almost like they surprise us with what they're able to do with a, smaller budget.
So normally when we start these videos off, John, you ask me what I would call the wide angle question, which is where you sort of take like quite a wide perspective on stuff and then sort of throw a question out there. But I was going to ask you on this time, and I thought, what do you think it is that is so, I mean, I have my idea about this, but what do you think is so compelling about the kind of team up movie, the Magnificent Seven, Seven Samurai, all this? Because it is, of all the kind of things that get remade, it is one that is just so pervasive, and we get it year after year after year. I mean, it's such a successful idea.
Yeah.
And you look at other classic stories like Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, they get remade quite a lot, but certainly not to the extent that like the team up fighting against a baddie kind of trope. So what's your thought on that?
Well, I mean, looking at things like the Expendables or, like the Fast and Furious ones, they're just great examples about how these pretty much franchises, never mind, of course, the different superhero series, right? And whether it's DC or Marvel and stuff, it's just something about this idea of people kind of getting together and against a common enemy and stuff like that. And I think that's something that's unique to us. Even looking at this kind of current situation with COVID-19 and everything, right? That's just another example of how we're probably more united now, being kind of separated in our homes and everything by this common enemy of this kind of invisible enemy and stuff. And I feel like that's something that like is very much ingrained in kind of the human DNA and stuff like that. We have this need or desire or like kind of withdrawn towards this kind of it's part of like what makes humanity, such a strong survivor, right? And stuff is at different times we pull together and you know, like maybe like when there's like this kind of incredible force that's kind of against us, like the next tribe over or whatever. But then despite losses to our tribe and everything, we survive and then thrive and then pass on our DNA and stuff like that. I think that's like, in other words, it's just something that's probably even beyond any kind of logical reason. It's something that's kind of almost hardwired into us.
I would agree. My take on it is I think society has been getting progressively more individualistic. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe Akira Kurosawa even sort of like picked up on that. There was something that was happening in Japan at that point in time.
Right.
And, he tapped into that somehow, because I think, a lot, especially these days, as you said, we're quite isolated regardless of COVID.
Right.
And I think these films kind of give us this idea of like, we're all kind of like getting together as a kind of social team and doing something productive, which is something we probably don't do very much in the real life really these days. So
yeah, I mean it's something that like, even if we like you said, because of how things like social media had one hand it kind of allows us to relate to each other, but it kind of still in different ways divides us. But despite that, we still have this drive towards some kind of common, bond and stuff like that. Like, in other words, you have like something that like say, the Iron Man thing, right? There's like Team Iron Man versus Team, Captain America and stuff like that. Even with, kind of something that like where, you're talking like superheroes, right? Which generally speaking, we're all on the side of the superheroes. But even then, there's this kind of like, it's almost like we're, on the one hand, we have this desire to come together, but the other, we still kind of will pull towards like different sides and stuff like that. It's kind of, I guess it's kind of weird. There's a weird tension, I guess, what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think another thing, we'll get into it when we start doing those movies, but the whole buddy cop genre kind of thing was something else that kind of, I think on a similar sort of lines taps into something there. But I guess, anyway, there we go. That's the sidetrack question for the day. So I guess we get back to our teams then that we're talking about tonight. You want to start with Hawk the Slayer?
Of course. With Hawk the Slayer, right, we of course have Jack Palance is back.
That's right.
As
Good old Jack Palance.
And so it's interesting. He actually has top billing, even though Hawk himself is, like the actor playing him, right, is a, fairly, known. I mean, not nearly as known as like that, but I guess that's partially like kind of the tradition of Hollywood, is that like, the star, if you will, is going to get top billing. So it's probably rare that the villain gets top billing, but here in this case, we have that. In the role of, Hawk, of course, is John Terry, who this is before his role as, as we talked about offline, in Lost, as Jack's father, kind of the lead character, stuff like that. One other character I thought was noteworthy, particular. We'll definitely get into the minor ones and stuff. The witch, actually, Patricia Quinn, she's actually was the lips for the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So I thought it was like an interesting tidbit. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course most of the other actors in this are actually from UK comedy movies. That's where they're better known. Yeah, you've got like Roy Kinnear, who's in various sort of things, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory as Veruca Salt's father. And you've got Bernard Bresslaw, who's best known for Carry On movies, which no one outside the UK seems to know about. They're terribly politically incorrect, I'd say, these days, so they probably won't get much airtime anymore. And you've got Graham Stark, who was in the Pink Panther movies.
Okay.
Trying to think, there's probably a couple more in there. It's quite a kind of a UK actor-packed movie. And the reason I was doing some reading on them, one of the reasons there might be all of these UK comedic actors, because Terry Marcel, I want to say, was the assistant director on a lot of the later Pink Panther movies. So he must have had a lot of connections with a lot of those actors who also appear in a lot of those movies as well.
Yeah. And, certainly like the other interesting aspect, as we kind of mentioned before, was that he thought that like what he was basing things on was Yojimbo, but of course, as we found, like kind of for us, it's pretty clear that it's not, for the very reason that Hawk the Slayer is very much about, like you said, bringing a team together, which Yojimbo is not. Like Yojimbo is about this kind of one warrior going into a town, and and all being about the money and stuff. And here, it's almost like the opposite, where the money is just simply what was needed to save the one nun and stuff. And if anything, I kind of we see like the other elements that's kind of similar to the Seven Samurai is that the abbey is now the village that is kind of secluded, and like the invaders are as we talked about different times too, like kind of we have again this kind of siege aspect and stuff, which kind of that's another element that seems to kind of be pretty much a common theme for these different movies.
Yeah, and I mean the nuns are like the perfect kind of defenseless victims. I mean the major difference I would say in that respect in terms of them is that there's no kind of corralling them to defend themselves at any point, which it actually makes it, which is probably the major difference I would say between this and a lot of the other Magnificent Seven Samurai remakes. So there is that element. There's also a kidnapping, which is of course slightly different from most of the others. Well, no, not in a sense though, because you could say that Rikichi's wife was kidnapped by the bandits, so it's maybe a different sort of spin on that. But clearly they don't have enough manpower. They've got to go out and assemble a team. Cue witch. And
the other thing that's kind of interesting they did kind of carry over though is the betrayal aspect. So that's something that it's interesting how that's something that, so if anything, this almost leans more towards Magnificent Seven, which really had that aspect, because Seven Samurai actually didn't really have that. So if anything, what Marcelo probably should have recognized was, like he's actually drawn things from the Magnificent Seven more than anything else.
Yeah, maybe he was just afraid of like lawsuits, and saw what happened to Sergio Leone. Right. Okay, throw a few curveballs their way. But yeah, you're right. It's right out of the Magnificent Seven sort of playbook. And you've even got in terms of the characters, Crow is very much a remake of Kyuzo, because there's a bet, and he has to sort of prove how much of a better sort of warrior he is. I would say the others, though, not so much. Well, they don't seem to be directly lifted from Seven Samurai or Magnificent Seven, unless there was something I kind of missed. No. I would say that kind of the dwarf character, who I've forgotten his name now, is he's kind of Balden. He's like the Kikuchiyo kind of character a little bit. I guess Bernard Bresslaw as the giant is kind of Heihachi maybe. But there's no children anywhere. But not really. I mean, he's just kind of very generic. He's
kind of like a good-hearted kind of, If anything, again, he kind of more reminds me of, in the remake of Magnificent Seven, right? Of what's his name? I'm drawing a blank now.
Oh yeah. I know who you mean. I know exactly. You mean the one where I had a big problem with his accent. Oh man, his name escapes me now. It's too late here, but. Vincent D'Onofrio. Yeah.
And it's interesting how kind of like what you mentioned before, that what really stands out overall about this as a remake, even if it's unofficial, is the granted it's a fantasy setting, so kind of part of it is the expectation of having fantastic kind of characters and stuff like that, but I mean, having an elf that fires arrows like a machine gun. I mean, it doesn't get more original than that, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is obviously years before Legolas in Lord of the Rings, and I think it's a very simple technique, but it kind of because what they do is basically, if you haven't seen the movie, they just cut out all the frames, so it just looks like it's just him just like immediately firing, kind of like a video game, is what I thought. I thought this is early '80s. They've just taken the video game kind of timing and just applied it to the elf's arrows, but it's kind of in an odd sort of way it's effective, and definitely back in the 80s it was effective. You just thought that elf was just, if you were getting into any fight, even with guns, you'd want that elf on your side. And also kind of like this idea of like Hawk having the mind sword, which from what I kind of infer from the story is that you can kind of its movements will be influenced by your mind, so you can think it and it will defend you perfectly in lots of situations and stuff. Yeah, I mean, poor old Balden the giant, and you know, your one-armed kind of crossbow man don't really have any superpowers, so to speak, but
the crossbow though did kind of rival
it did,
you know, the skills of the elf though.
yeah, he's pretty quick too. I mean, I guess he's kind of like a hybrid Kanbei kind of character. Well, he's sort of like a cross between Kanbei and Manzo, more or less. No, not Manzo. I would say Rikichi, because he has to go and try and find Hawk, and he's the one who's actually going and finding them. So yeah, I suppose he loses his hand. I don't know if that's any kind of symbolic kind of reference to other things, but it's not a very strong one if it is. So yeah. The other thing, of course, that it's not really related to the similarities with Seven Samurai, but there is a lot of slow motion horse riding.
Oh, right.
Through puddles. And it's funny when you watch it, because I remember thinking that was terribly dramatic, you know, when I was like 9 or something. And yeah, it's when you look at it now, you see there's actually just like perfect forest and trees either side. And just like there's just one little stream in the middle, and obviously the director wants him to go through the water to go with the splashing and the slow motion. You just think surely it would just be easier to ride on one side of the bank, just much easier. And there's quite a lot of slow motion horse riding in that movie.
Right. Yeah, I mean that definitely was something that was unique to this movie. That like anytime that they wanted to emphasize, like you said, the speed, they actually went slower. And then, particularly even for battles too. So it's actually almost the opposite of right now in modern day, kind of filming, right, of like superheroes and stuff like that, where they try to go for as much speed as possible, kind of like this blinding lure. And I find that it's actually pretty effective. Like kind of it's to me it kind of conveys more of like that power of a moment and stuff like that. And it's kind of ironic because in a way it stretches out the length of the film and stuff. It does,
yeah. It gets the running time up there. No, but you're right. There's definitely like a lot of playing around with timing, and you've got the elf firing super kind of almost on fast forward, and you've got him riding around in slow motion. He's not the only director to do that, because of course we watched the Pink Panther a couple of weeks ago, and I watched some of the 70s ones, and what's interesting is the fights with Kato, which is some of the most sort of memorable sort of comedic scenes in it. There are bits where they've obviously sped them up, and then when they kind of like dive through walls or destroy something, that's all done in slow motion. And it's kind of it's quite effective in that as well, this use of playing around with timing stuff. As you said, everything now is just it's almost everything is made just to overpower your senses rather than get you to actually absorb what's going on in the story. So
and I find that also when you do something in slow motion, that kind of almost reveals in a way that like how clean the shot is and stuff like that. So in other words, there's less room for mistakes, and so you have to really be precise then. I mean, which is kind of like, to me, for a lower budget film and stuff like that, it's kind of like almost I don't know, I'm trying to think of a way to say it, but it's almost like their pride or their willingness to kind of basically say, hey, we've got nothing to hide, because you can hide things in the blur of motion, but when you do it in slow motion, it's like less room for error, and you kind of have to make it more, like it's almost like kind of like a magician saying, like, hey, kind of, if you can figure it out, go have at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think one of some of the magic stuff, speaking of budgetary limitations, I did like the fact that the witch, one of her powers is to kind of disable someone with silly string at one stage. That seems to be one of her superpowers. And the other one was, she said, I will distract them with a bevy of fireballs.
Right.
And then it just seems to be an awful lot of sort of ping pong balls with LED lights get thrown into a room, which was pretty amazing. Although the most impressive effect, I think, is the Superman style rings that they're sitting moving between different places. That was actually pretty effective. I mean, for such a low budget movie, that would actually look pretty cool. But and the other the other bit that I always found intriguing, remembering this movie, was this sort of the evil wizard, witch, whatever they were. You couldn't really tell from their voice,
right?
But the one who kind of is basically Voltar's beautician, who kind of just numbs his side of his face, but doesn't really seem to do much else, and just says, "Oh, we'll have use for you," but doesn't really do anything other than just zap his face with a crystal. There's obviously something else in that crystal, because I don't think you couldn't be that evil or that addicted. I don't know what she's spiking that crystal with, but it keeps him coming back for more.
So, I always felt like it was a little bit of a kind of a Darth Vader thing kind of going to, like, like an Emperor, like kind of, the way the helmet looked and stuff like that. And it was
absolutely.
hiding his face and stuff.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's like it's half a half Vader helmet.
Right.
It's identical. Yeah. I mean, I would say, of course, there is a very different thing about Hawk the Slayer, and that is all the familial stuff, which is often kind of tied in with fantasy things. Because, you've got, he's Hawk's brother, which is, that's, I mean, of all the Magnificent Seven remakes, I don't know we've got one where there's a kind of, well, actually, no, there was actually. In the Seven Magnificent Gladiators, the Italian fantasy movie, the mother of the village elder's son was the bad guy. But in this one, you've got the two, the hero and the antagonist are both brothers, which is kind of interesting. Very unlikely brothers, given the age difference, or I don't know. Yeah, but yeah. So you got that familial tie. You've also got this kind of thing of where, there's another bit in most sort of Seven Samurai remakes where the bad guys come and do an attack first, and that kind of fails, and they go back and regroup for the final attack. And in this one, you've kind of got that with Voltar's son, who kind of just comes along and thinks he can do everything, and and screws up, and they have to regroup again. Oops, sorry, I got my phone. So yeah.
And I think that's another element, like like you say, about how for some reason, I don't know if it's the fantasy aspect, but like there's also that family relation that is kind of unique to this. We're having a son and stuff like that, and I think overall another reason why it's to me like tied more towards Magnificent Seven versus Seven Samurai is that in the original Magnificent Seven, you had like kind of the one villain stand out and stuff like that. Versus like Seven Samurai, it was kind of like a group of them and everything, and there wasn't like this kind of like leader, so to speak, and stuff. Even though like it was implied that there was a leader of the bandits and stuff like that. And so in here, of course, we have Voltan and everything, and despite the fact that what's interesting is the son is the one who literally kind of sparks things off again after like kind of the like I said, the first battle and stuff like that, because he's like kind of just say, just give me the gold, and then of course, like kind of that triggers the first battle where not only is he lose puts up, but then also that his death then kind of infuriates Voltan even more.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of interesting this because it becomes a kind of a revenge plot on both sides, really, because of course we're forgetting the romance as well that sort of started Voltan off, and that is kind of. I mean, from that, you would have thought Hawk would be, you expect him to be a little bit more kind of annoyed and vengeful. And he's not really, he's quite calm. In fact, he's not really, he's probably one of the he's the least memorable character in the movie, actually, funnily enough. And I guess you could put that down to the mind sword. He's so at one with that he's peaceful. But so they kind of tried to make him more of a Jedi, I think. I think that's the idea. But he just came across as a bit kind of emotionless and uninterested. Whereas Jack Palance gets like progressively more and more angry and violent as the movie goes on. So
yeah, it's funny how like we can have these characters, right, which we've talked about in the other, original and the, like other remakes and stuff like that of the series, that you can have the stoicism, but you can make the person, the hero, so stoic though, to the point that like they just seem to be pretty much like emotionless, and then it doesn't really inspire the audience to kind of really root for them as much, and like kind of like it's almost like kind of like the idea of Superman that like if he doesn't have the kind of kryptonite of the weakness, and stuff, then it's kind of really a lot less sympathetic. It's a lot harder to kind of identify with them.
Yeah, it's a very delicate balance, I think, in the performance where you have to have someone who's carrying that weight of this harsh reality,
right,
but still kind of keeping their head, or trying, you've got to portray both of those things at the same time. Whereas if you, like you said, you just come up as a robot, you don't have that kind of acceptance of it at all. So, yeah.
And
right.
part of it may be just simply John Terry too, because as good as an actor as he is, but what comes out also, even in the Lost series of stuff, when we see like kind of him as Jack's father, he really comes across as kind of like very much like like not quite indifferent, but just like a cold, distant kind of which like kind of that's kind of partially why we see there's this tension in their relationship and stuff like that. So I think different times with his, at least with these performances, that's what kind of really comes out, is kind of his John Terry's ability to kind of play this kind of very distant kind of character and stuff like that. That like it's on the one hand different things are kind of going on around them, but they kind of still seem pretty detached from it all.
Yeah, and maybe it's not a subtle movie by any stretch of the imagination, Hawk the Slayer. So he may be better off in more subtle roles than a sword brandishing, warrior in the Dark Ages. So yeah.
Any other thoughts about like kind of? Oh, actually, I did want to mention one thing though, that with the nun's insistence to trust Voltan and stuff, it's like that's something that they really did play up and stuff, and something that like we really don't see as much in the other versions and everything. And I feel like like kind of to me the idea that really comes to mind is how Oprah Winfrey often will quote Maya Angelou as saying, like, when somebody shows you the first time who they are, believe them.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's also if you think about it in terms of Seven Samurai remake, you've got a kind of a role reversal of honor a little bit, because I mean, they obviously, as the nuns in the abbey, have their honor code, and they will kind of like trust Voltan's deal to their own deficit, and it's almost like the others have to say, "Come on, get real," and it also kind of makes the one nun's betrayal that much worse. So there's a kind of a bit of a mixture of a bit of a role reversal there in terms of that element. The only other thing I wanted to mention was that actually, if you listen to the music, the sort of pan pipes that are used in it do actually kind of sound like a Wild West movie. They've got a kind of a Western thing going on there.
It reminded me of Karate Kid, actually. It kind of has that kind of effect where like it's almost like on a like you said, Western, but almost like a little bit Eastern as well and stuff like that. I'm kind of wondering if there's like some kind of influence there that maybe like kind of we're not aware of and stuff.
Yeah, just a subtle nod to the person who made the first movie. So yeah. So speaking of subtle nods, it seems to have taken quite a while for people to realize that A Bug's Life is actually like a Seven Samurai Magnificent Seven remake.
It's funny. It seems like that's almost like kind of ignored.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
So speaking of subtle nods, it seems to have taken quite a while for people to realize that A Bug's Life is actually like a Seven Samurai Magnificent Seven remake.
It's funny. It seems like that's almost like kind of ignored, or like kind of it's pretty clear, like based on us watching it in this context and stuff. But yet, I feel like it's almost like one of those things that like I don't feel like anybody's talked about it and everything. So let's kind of dive into that and stuff.
Yeah. Because apparently when asked, they say it's based on the Aesop's fable of the ant and the grasshopper,
right,
which has a story that's nothing like this at all. But I mean, there's certain stylistic cues that give it away, and that the grasshoppers all live in a Mexican hat stroke cantina. And there's a kind of like a Wild West themed soundtrack all the way through A Bug's Life.
Right.
I mean, in terms of plot elements, you know, they're gathering food for these bandit grasshoppers. They, you know, when the heroes turn up, they run and hide because they're scared. You know, there's also, in fact, like Seven Samurai, it's almost directly the same in that they're gathering food and they can't gather enough food to keep themselves alive and feed the bandits. So it's almost identical in that respect. I would say that them building the bird is the same as the village bolstering their villagers to get them involved in the fight. So yeah, those are the main kind of plot elements, but I would say there are definitely differences with it.
Oh yeah.
Because of the time, because of the running time is nowhere near enough to pack all of Seven Samurai in. So a lot of the characters are hybrids, which I guess we can get into in a bit. But I would say the main different themes are, well, I would say it's similar and it's not. There's a lot of reversals in that Princess Atta is kind of almost like the opposite of Katsushiro and Shino in Seven Samurai, because she's like the peasant girl and he's from the upper class.
Right.
This time she's the royalty and he's the, and there's also that kind of unrequited angle there as well. Likewise, you kind of got Flick it's more of a kind of a hero's journey based around him rather than around the group. The group is very much an accessory to his kind of gaining acceptance, and even though you can tell he's like this kind of clever inventor, no one really recognizes it until he kind of saves the village. So that's kind of a different, it's more of a kind of hero's journey in that respect. I would say the main theme that I think that's different is this kind of theme of inequality. That you know, the grasshoppers, there's a scene where Hopper's saying, you know, he takes one of the grains and he throws it at one of them. He said, okay, this is an ant. Does this hurt? And he goes, no. And then he does another one and says, no. And he said, then he pulls the whole thing and all the grain falls. And he said, okay, what about now? He says, the thing is, you don't realize is that they outnumber us 100 to 1. We've got to keep them afraid, and we've got to keep our, you know, power dynamic so that we can control them. If we don't have that, then we're lost. And I thought, well, that's, you know,
that's apartheid.
yeah, exactly. You know, so, or various other sort of power structures over the years. So that was a very sort of, and the fact that, you know, it's, you know, we're looking at ants is kind of, you know, there's definitely that kind of feeling of inequality between.
I think what's really interesting about this is how, like, Pixar really, one of the things that the way they position themselves is that even though that, like, you know, like a huge part of the market is kids, but they're very adult, you know, stories. I mean, and here we have it as well, that, like, you know, even though that, like, it's, you know, kids can watch it and stuff like that, but as an adult, we appreciate, like, kind of these more subtle layers, like this kind of idea of apartheid essentially and stuff. And also, like, kind of, you know, that different times, like, you know, the hero's journey, and, you know, it's just kind of like just those aspects about it that, like, combines the charm, and it's kind of this kind of catering towards, you know, like, at a younger, you know, audience and stuff. But meanwhile, that it's absolutely recognizes that, like, you know, the people who are buying the tickets are the adults that's kind of, you know, taking the kids along and stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, I think that's true with a lot of cartoon shows as well. You see some of the most successful ones definitely have elements that appeal to adults, because the really sort of kid. I mean, certainly my daughter isn't really allowed. I wouldn't say allowed, but I mean, I'll be more happy to turn on the one that has something that I will be entertained by than. But yeah, and it makes you also wonder, and I'm sure there is a whole thing you could go into here, where how many kids' movies are just classic adult movies reskinned.
Right.
You know, I mean, I heard that The Lion King is basically King Lear reskinned. So, and I guess, what's the other one I'm thinking of? One that's The Tempest, that's kind of just redone. can't think of which movie it is now, but there's definitely a lot of them. And I'm sure if you went through them, it's either that or they just take really successful foreign movies and reskin them for Disney. So
one thing though, kind of related to that idea though, it's interesting how some of these, these animations will attract some pretty big stars to do the voiceovers, and for them, it's not that big of a paycheck because bottom line is that they can't pay them a full star salary, like to be in these. And I feel that the reason why is because when a lot of these stars are parents themselves, that it's it's like almost like a vanity project, right? It's for them kind of hey kids, that's I'm in the Bug's Life and stuff like that. I mean, it's got to be really like kind of for them like a huge thing to be able to kind of say something like that.
Oh, totally, yeah. No, I mean you hear that in a lot of interviews when people are doing their kind of press tours. They've been in a they wanted to be in a movie that they can show their kids, and it's not them sort of gunning down people on a regular basis. So you often see that. So. And why not? If you're going to get paid millions of dollars and your kids can watch it too, that's great.
And I think definitely like of course we kind of mentioned Hopper and stuff, but for some of these stars they probably could use a better PR and stuff like that. Like Kevin Spacey, he's definitely fallen on some pretty bad times and stuff like that, with him being in the news for all the sexual harassment stuff. But some of these other stars though, like I wanted to note that Hayden Panetierre, she's 9 years old in A Bug's Life, and so this is way before she became the cheerleader from Heroes and stuff. So let's see, Julia Louise Dreyfus. This is years after like kind of Seinfeld, heyday and stuff like that.
Right. And then, who was she in? Was she Princess Atta?
Princess Atta, yep.
Yeah, right, okay.
And then, we have like kind of a lot of these older stars too, who like, you just haven't, maybe heard from in a while or something like that. Like Phyllis Diller was the queen and stuff. So she's like kind of, by that point, like kind of, she's kind of not nearly as active and stuff like that. Let's see who else. David Hyde Pierce from Frasier is Slim the Walking Stick and everything.
Right, yeah.
Denis Leary is back again. We've had him from Tom's Crown Affair, and so he's the male ladybug in this case.
yeah, that's pretty funny. That's casting there. I mean, I would say kind of in terms of are they representative of the original Seven Samurai characters, I would say it's more kind of analogical or metaphorical kind of in that I think the stick insect is kind of Kyuzo in a way, in that he's like a living weapon, so to speak.
Right.
In how he's portrayed a little bit in it. I mean, I suppose Francis is kind of the Kikuchiyo because he's liked by kids.
Yes.
And he's kind of hot-headed. And it's kind of like the has a sort of ego that's kind of out of control a little bit and gets him into trouble.
Right.
I mean, the others, they're all kind of like such accessory characters. You could kind of just, I can't really say that any of them other than really, maybe Flick is kind of like a Kanbei really, because he's the actual leader.
Right.
Yeah, all the rest are sort of a blur really.
And I think the big twist too, major spoiler, is that of course that they're not really warriors. So that's actually one way that they can basically argue that like, hey, we're not, Magnificent Seven or Seven Samurai and stuff like that. It's because is that that's a huge twist and stuff like that, and which actually like kind of is really both kind of crafty and also it emphasizes, like you said, Flick's hero's journey and stuff, because ultimately he's got to transform from kind of like a fearful, reluctant hero to somebody who stands up to Hopper and stuff. And so that transformation, of course, could only happen if, like, in fact, like, he had to, like there was no actual warriors to kind of help him like that. But of course, they flip it around again that, like, in the end, they are able to kind of, help him, kind of become that hero himself because of the fact that, like, they kind of come back and, so that's actually one thing that kind of really draws from Magnificent Seven is that, like, they kind of, depart, but then they come back and stuff.
Yeah, they get kicked out of the village, and the villagers go back to And in fact, actually, I think in Magnificent Seven, Calvera actually moves into the village, doesn't he?
Yes, yes.
They make a deal, he moves in. So that is almost direct from Magnificent Seven, because the same thing happens with the grasshoppers. But yeah, I mean, I think, and there's the difference, I guess, is the betrayal angle in that rather than the villagers betraying the heroes, in this case, well, it's really Flick is the one responsible for perpetuating this betrayal of the villagers. So you've got a kind of slight reversal there. But yeah, you're right. It's very clever making them not really warriors, and that really just in terms of like reimagining that, you know, the Seven Samurai stroke Magnificent Seven story, it definitely focuses back on Flick, and it just allows for more comedy and things like this. It's a really clever thing for them to do with it. So
yeah, and I think that's something that you know, Pixar really does well, is that they find the core emotional elements and stuff, and they kind of bring those, like they highlight those. And so in other words, you know, one thing that we've talked about before, that with a lot of remakes in general, is that what they do, you know, kind of poorly, is understanding what is the core story, and then, you know, heightening those elements and stuff. Because different things, like, you know, they would have the superficial elements that they would copy, and those are fine, and they're kind of mechanisms to, you know, kind of give you some kind of structure. But unless you kind of bring out what is the real, you know, core emotional aspect of things, the motivations, then, you know, a lot gets lost. And then if anything, it kind of just dilutes the power of the story. And here, like, I think what's great, what they do though, is because they emphasize things on Flick, that then, you know, kind of things are centered on his struggle to kind of, you know, going from being like an embarrassing, you know, accident prone. In fact, if anything, he's the cause actually of the original conflict with the grasshoppers. And so because of that, he, you know, kind of redeems himself by the fact that, like, you know, he goes out, even though he makes his mistake and everything, and even though he kind of plays into the deception of, like, and after he realizes that, like, oops, they're not really warriors, they're circus and stuff. But then they come up with this plan, and like you said, with the giant bird and stuff like that. And it's you know, actually really, like, you know, clever to kind of bring it to that. The story is about him kind of, you know, fixing the mess he's made and stuff, and then meanwhile kind of being better for it and stuff.
And you're right though, there's still a lot of very key beats that are still the same there, in that you've got unrequited love, you know, a group of harmless victims being terrorized by people on a basis, and a down on their luck team that has to kind of assemble and help them all out. So, you know, all the core parts of the original kind of story are there, but just
and the animation though, like, I what I love about it too, granted, you know, we kind of can go you know, like, oh wow, it's kind of really well done in terms of, you know, kind of how things look and everything, but it doesn't draw attention to itself. It's just basically the backdrop, and like kind of, you know, like they understand that, like, they've got to have the strong story, and then the animation, if anything, has to, like, kind of, you know, go more to the background. Because here's the thing, that, like, the previous movie was a Toy Story, and that kind of, you know, allowed Pixar to get on the map for being a, you know, serious, you know, kind of power player in movies and stuff like that. And what Steve Jobs said actually was that, like, you know, with a lot of companies, is that they struggled to have a follow-up product after their first success and stuff. He said that even with Apple, they kind of ran into that. So recognizing that, I feel like they kind of really, you know, were more careful about crafting, like, kind of, you know, this to be the successful second product and stuff, that they, and I feel like that they did that by simply, you know, understanding that it's all about the story. That's not about, you know, impressing people with, like, the fact that, like, you know, oh, we have, like, the ability to show bugs in the, you know, kind of cool fashion and stuff like that. Because, you know, granted, you know, the bugs do look cool, and, you know, like, because the grasshoppers are kind of scary, like, considering their animation nerds like that. They do kind of have these, you know, ability to kind of convey something that, like, it's intimidating, and meanwhile it's the ants, even though, like, the ants, right, which, like, to people, you know, like, at a picnic, the last thing you want is ants and stuff. But here, they're kind of anthropomorphically made kind of cute, kind of almost cuddly characters and stuff. So it's kind of interesting how they kind of had the villains being very villainous and the heroes being very kind of sympathetic and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of their key skills, really, is making things that are interesting or difficult palatable and cute in a way. But that was one of the other things I really like about Pixar stuff, is looking at their work over the years, because you realize as well there is a technical, even though they don't put it to the forefront, there is a technical progression that's very obvious, and there's things that they could only do at certain times, given the constraints of how long it would have taken to render various scenes and things like this. Like Wall-E is a much more visually complex movie than a lot of the ones that go before it, simply because the amount of trash that's in all of the scenes on Earth are pretty mind-blowing. And I'm sure, compared to the rather simple textures of toys, the iridescent sort of colors in the shell, in the exoskeletons of insects and some of their more complicated structures were probably, it was probably a much more ambitious project from a technical perspective than Toy Story in that respect, in terms of the models they were using. And I'm sure you see that going on. I'm sure with I'm guessing lighting and reflections was probably something they had to make a big increase in to do Cars, because of course you've got so many reflections, lots of sort of light sources and things like this and something like that. But, interesting. Speaking of which, apparently Cars is apparently a remake of Doc Hollywood with Michael J. Fox. Apparently they're very, very similar, so we might have to look into that.
It is, yeah. I can definitely see that.
Yeah, I'm sure there's others as well.
Yeah.
This rate, we're going to have to do a kind of kids, Disney remakes of stuff. But
let's see here.
So, any further thoughts on It's a Bug's Life?
I think that's probably the main things that, like, I feel like the ability to kind of recognize, kind of what it is that were the core kind of parts of this story and stuff like that. And it just definitely, like, I think they get away with, like, kind of, not being kind of called out on being a kind of a cheap remake and stuff like that, is because of the surprises, of the charm and stuff like that, of both the characters and the way that it plays out and stuff like that. Because, certainly for us, like, we see the elements of the Magnificent Seven and, even Seven Samurai and stuff like that. But I think it's because it's done so well in its unique kind of way of packaging it, that it's not simply like a shoddy remake and stuff by any stretch.
No.
It's done with such skill and care that you really appreciate what they've done and to add to the story and stuff.
Yeah, and it's funny. I mean, I think that's even some of the lowest budget Magnificent Seven remakes are actually still really good. Even Haunt the Slayer and Battle Beyond the Stars are actually pretty watchable movies. They're pretty good. There's enough reinvention. I wonder if it's almost like one of those things where you have to make it so, different enough that you don't get sued, but interesting enough that you're still kind of paying homage to the original idea to some degree or something. But yeah, it's they were quite watchable, all pretty good in their own way.
I think, if you just put a decent enough effort, right, where, if you just go beyond the bar set by something like Seven Magnificent Gladiators, you can have something pretty decent, like I think that's the thing. It just kind of put some heart into it, put some effort and stuff for God's sake and stuff like that, and you'll at least achieve a cult classic status. Yeah,
which there was actually from Yojimbo. Apparently, there was another remake that we missed, and that's called The Warrior and the Sorceress.
You mentioned that, yeah.
Yeah, and that's David Carradine. But I did actually sort of have a quick look at it. But it seems the Sorceress is mostly topless through the entire movie. So it's setting the bar
big
kind of
point,
yeah. I guess it was kind of these quasi-Italian kind of production.
Right.
So now, I mean, obviously, I've got a child, and I've watched a lot of Pixar movies, fairly, So where would you put It's a Bug's Life in terms of best Pixar, worst Pixar?
Yeah, it's definitely up there. For me, actually, like the one that really strikes home as one of the best so far as a standalone is Ratatouille and stuff. I would put that as like one of the one, like next to Toy Story, it's definitely up there and stuff like that. Bugs Life is not too far from there. And then probably like some of the other, other ones. Like for me, like the other one's kind of just, it's probably like a huge pile that's like probably maybe after the first, 2 or 3, stuff like that. It's probably like a pretty, it really, I guess, the third place, so to speak, kind of really stretches out quite a bit. Finding Nemo is also another one that's really up there, I feel.
Yeah, Finding Nemo is very good, actually. I would say, Finding Nemo is probably one of maybe my number one. I'm not sure. I mean, I really do like Wall-E, just because I'm a fan of 70s dystopic sci-fi. So for me, that just hits all the right notes. And I quite like sort of the homage to silent movies and things like this. I think that's a really cool movie. I think it's just a very foreboding message in that movie. Right. I also really thought it wasn't actually, I didn't like it so much for the actual story, but I thought the whole idea behind Inside Out was so ambitious.
Yeah.
And I really admired them for trying to make a kid's movie out of psychology.
Right.
And that was such an original idea. And I feel like it didn't really get very much kind of traction.
No.
But it's a really interesting movie, that.
I have to admit that, like, I didn't, I don't know, I avoided it, but like I definitely was not rushing to see it because like I kind of knew about the psychological aspect and stuff. But when I watched it, though, it was very watchable. So it was interesting how, like, like sometimes with some of these, movies or stories, we can have a resistance because it's something that like kind of go, it sounds okay and stuff like that. But then, ultimately with especially because it's Pixar, it's almost like kind of once you watch it, it's like kind of you tend to just like, I don't know, like definitely just, I wouldn't say fall in love, but another one that actually we didn't mention though was Up. That's actually another one that's kind of like that, where like I was kind of like, it seems like a so-so story, whatever. But after the first few minutes, I was hooked. Like kind of seeing like the the two characters, like kind of Ellie and what's his name, just their relationship and stuff like that. It was kind of like that was just.
Yeah, I mean that's that. I mean it almost became a bit of a kind of a trope of Pixar movies in that they would have some brutal emotional blow within the first 10 minutes, and then the rest of the movie was kind of like, kind of getting back to that. But Up was I kind of I felt Up didn't really track after that. I almost felt like the first 20 minutes, half an hour could have been almost like a short movie. It seemed like one of their short movies that just kind of got a bit too long in a way. But I mean, good. Don't get me wrong, but it wasn't one of my absolute favorites.
No, yeah.
I mean, God, the Finding Nemo, that's like, oof, that's harsh, That's almost one of those ones where you've got to fast forward the first 5 minutes so that the child doesn't end up in tears, But yeah,
they definitely know, like overall, how to tug at the heartstrings. I mean, that's one thing that is a kind of trademark Pixar. Like how Pixar movie and stuff.
Yeah, and it's surprising when you think about things like Yojimbo and Fistful of Dollars. Mm-hmm. They had the child whose mother is there, but within eye line, but she can't actually can't go and hold its mother and stuff. So it was just surprising that in the more modern Last Man Standing they didn't use that. It's like one of the most sort of powerful things about that. But anyway, that was another video.
I was going to say though that definitely goes back to the whole save the cat thing and stuff. That basic premise that you have to have that emotional connection with your audience and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I guess the only one they've got the new one coming out, Soul, this year. I think it looks quite interesting. I mean, they've tackled cognitive psychology. They're now going to tackle the afterlife, which they kind of did in Coco, but it's going to be interesting to see what they do with this one. So
Right, and I think that's the thing that like I could definitely see like kind of the religious factions kind of up in arms pretty soon because being that it's a Hollywood thing, it won't they got to kind of skirt the religious themes and stuff like that, and they can't make it totally like kind of about Christianity or
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all the atheists will be up in arms, of course, as well. But, yeah.
Alrighty. So coming up, we'll definitely be looking at Planet of the Apes. It's actually a few different kind of both originals and remakes and stuff. As we discovered, it's we have the one in of course 1968 with Charlton Heston, which is kind of one that I'm looking forward to rewatching, and then a Tim Burton version, which was something that like surprised us to the extent that like. I have to admit that I kind of forgot that it was Tim Burton, who had done it and stuff.
Yeah.
And then because it is so unlike a typical Tim Burton movie.
Totally, yeah.
And and then we'll definitely look at how it was, kind of given a reboot in I think it was about 10 years or so ago and stuff. That definitely kind of really. I feel that series was one that like is another great example of a reason to do remake. Because they definitely brought a lot to that conversation. So look forward to kind of talking about that one as well.
Absolutely. Sounds good.
So once again, thanks for watching. And definitely we'll see you next time at the movies.